Okay, I think we are ready to start this webinar. So hello everyone, welcome to this ESG speaker series. My name is Gustav Tunge, and on behalf of the Earth System Governance Project, I would like to welcome you all to the second ESG speaker series of 2021. The title of today's discussion is It's About Time, Temporality, Tensions, and Earth System Governance of the Future. If this is the first time that you engage with the Earth System Governance Project, we are the largest social science research network in the area of governance and global environmental change. We are a pluralistic and vibrant research community that encourages collaborations among a network of scholars and hosts a stimulating annual conference each year. If you're engaged in similar research, I encourage you to consider applying to become a research fellow. We organized this ESG speaker series to provide a platform for the ongoing research discussions and output of the scholars of the Earth System Governance Project. Fellows of the network propose the topics and lead the dialogue of this series. Today, we are focusing on an age-old question, time. And across research disciplines of Earth System Governance, there has been a shared concern that contemporary conceptions of time are inhibiting meaningful progress in environmental politics. To address this concern, the webinar will explore these issues from a range of perspectives. I'm excited, therefore, to introduce today's facilitator, Jeroen Ullman from the Urban Future Studio at Utrecht University. The Urban Future Studio has been our partner in shaping this, the theme of this webinar, and is a studio committed to understanding how we imagine the future in the present and how we use such understanding to shape a better and more sustainable future. Jeroen's research focuses on the social, cultural, and scientific practices that create society's conceptions of the future. Jeroen will be joined by two distinguished speakers. Our first speaker is Banyana Milkoret. She is a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Sociology and Human Geography at the University of Oslo. Her research integrates global environmental governance and cognitive theories to study actor motivations, institutional design, and political behavior related to climate change. Our second speaker is Victor Gallas, Associate Professor in Political Science and Deputy Director of the Stockholm Resilience Center. His research explored governance challenges created by rapid global change. And before we begin, some notes on housekeeping. There will be an informal Zoom get-together after the webinar for those who wish to connect with the ESG project or other attendees. We will post a link in the chat towards the end of the webinar. Only panelists, chairs, and moderators' videos and audios are available. Q&A and chat is open to all. And if you like to ask a question throughout this webinar, we ask you to please use the Q&A function. And if you wish to upvote someone else's question, you can then upvote that in the Q&A function. Also, if you want to direct your question to a certain speaker, we ask you to please write their name before your question. I will now pass it over to Jeroen, who will lead this session from here. Thank you all and welcome.
Thank you, Gustav. Like Gustav said, I'm very excited to be here. I'm part of the Urban Future Studio normally, so as you can guess, what we're typically focused on is our conceptions of the future and where they come from. So this speaker series and then this focus on time for me is also somewhat of an excuse to dive in behind what is really our conceptions of the future. So why that focus on time and temporality? Because these issues are prominent, but we tend to often overlook really what we mean by time and temporality. And for this brief introduction, I will even conflate time and temporality for the most part. I don't have much time to go into that, but as you can see in the next slide, this is a quote by Dipesh Chakrabarty, who wrote in his A Climate of History that the current planetary crisis of climate change or global warming elicits a variety of responses in individuals, groups, and governments, ranging from denial, disconnect, and indifference to a spirit of engagement and activism of various kinds and degrees. So these responses saturate our sense of the now with, as you can see in the next slide, a sense of despair about the future, despair about the sense of the present and the future, the connection between past, present, and future. Or, as you can see in the next slide, a moment of urgency, that we have only 12 years to save the climate, or only an X amount of months to really change, or only this. There's always this sense of the future as a threat or as a deadline, too, in our saturation of the particular moment in time that we are experiencing right now. So as you can see in the next slide, for Dipesh Chakrabarti, the current crisis can precipitate a sense of the present that disconnects the future from the past by putting such a future beyond grasp of historical sensibility. And Chakrabarti writes really as an intervention in the practice of writing history, not so much a political intervention that might be on the minds of many of the ESG people, but really about how do we write history. And he says the discipline of history exists on the assumption that our past, present, and future are connected by a certain continuity of human experience. So we normally envision the future with the help of the same faculty that allows us to picture the past. And I would argue this doesn't really just go for history, right? This goes for our self-conception, our cultural self-conception, our political self-conception. But there is another, can you go back, Gustav? There's one other idea that's really here, that it's not just a disconnect between past, present, and future, but there's also an implicit continuity that we find in our environmental moment today, where more than ever, perhaps, we find that looking back from the past, and especially the present, in terms of emission pathways, in terms of biodiversity degradation that we are causing in the present, shapes our future. So on the one hand, it's a culturally and historically unprecedented moment. On the other hand, that sense of continuity is stronger perhaps than it's ever been. Underlying that is a conception of time. So if we go to the next slide, what is that idea of time? Well, we don't talk about it a lot, but we have that physics conception of time, where it's a dimension of space-time to be traversed and navigated through different directions and manners by different particles. We have a personal idea of time, a cognitive idea that where time describes a subjective experience, though that experience is always mediated depending on some activity or culture that you exist in. But that brings us to that question, that very difficult question: what is time culturally and political, and why should we care about it in our environmental politics and at this particular moment? So if you go to the next slide, there is no one time. There is never one cultural time. Anthropologists have written a lot about cyclical time versus linear time, where either you experience time as a recurring series of events, usually depending on generations or on geophysical systems or yearly rhythms, versus linear time, where the past, present, and future spread out linearly. And the future may be vastly different from the present, as in it might happen in eschatological time, where there is an endpoint to history. Or futurist time, which, according to the historian François Hartog, was something that we experienced a lot in the early 20th century and less now, where the future was manifestly different from the present in that it was better, that it was more advanced. Presentist time, in the way that we think about the future always as an extension, a simple extension of the present. More and more, we see calls to think about deep time and geological time as something that frames our experience, that that which is a human generation or a human lifetime is not the way that we should talk about the future and about our time experience. And this influences the way that we do politics. And as we see in the next slide, our politics grapple with the conception of time incessantly, because they consistently ask what are the appropriate times to think about and the appropriate time frames that we should think about. Do we exist in a tension between political time, 4-year electoral spans, 10-year policy planning, versus long durée planning, which we seem to need in our environmental moment? Or is that even too narrow? Should we even think about human political time over generations, as in 30 years, 60 years, versus a conception of geological time? Should we be thinking about, as Hanush and Bierman say, deep time organizations that spread out thousands of years into the future? Well, this matters because, as you can see in that slide, culturally and politically, time describes far more than just duration. It also gives us a directionality. It describes imagined relationships and responsibilities between a past and a present and a future. Relationships within the present. It describes ideas about who should mitigate, where, when, and how. When do, for example, emissions from the 1850s, do they still count in today's ideas about mitigation? Time influences geographical relationships because, again, it describes a way of what we care about. So in that sense, it always describes a relationship with the desirable. What can we work towards? What do we work towards? And on what time scales and what sort of conception of time do we do so? Next slide, please. So we are in this particular moment at a time where our usual historical practices, or our practices period, for visualizing times, past, present, and future, times that are usually inaccessible to us personally, which Dipesh Chakrabarty again calls the exercise of historical understanding, are thrown into a deep contradiction and confusion. And this is why I find thinking about time so interesting, because we need to make sense of this particular moment that we're in. And it's very, well, it's a time of contradiction and confusion. And I think this is why I'm also really happy to have Manjana and Victor here, because they have both quite unique and interesting takes on how can we figure out those moments of contradiction and confusion. So without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Manjana to discuss with us how we can deal with the issue of time and futurity and experience.
Thank you very much, Jeroen, also for this really interesting lead into a conversation of time. Now, while Jeroen might have been trying to get away from talking about the future by talking about time, I will take us straight back to the future. Actually, having titled my talk, Earth System Governance as Making Futures ? So what I want to do is, first of all, go a bit deeper into why think about the future, which Jeroen has already done quite beautifully right now. And then talking about governance for or of the future, or the future as a governance object and the need for imagination in doing so. And then diving mostly into some of the empirical work I have done around the cognition related to the future and related to time. So since that is quite a lot to do in 15 minutes, let's start here. So of course, there are lots of different reasons to think about time, and lots of theories that we have in governance and political science are doing that, and whether that's historical institutionalism or thinking about rates and speed of change, path dependency, and so forth. But recently we have seen this massive wave of interest in the future and in thinking about future governance and the future as something that is of interest and of relevance to what we do. And not just because the future as such is challenging and interesting to understand, but because that imagining and governing the future is now kind of a core challenge for sustainability in research and practice. So not just for us scholars, but of course for those who are making the choices affecting the future. And as scholars have recently also explored, that ideas of the future inform action in the present. So this matters because it shapes the politics of today. So ways of knowing, forecasting, and actively anticipating future events are crucial elements of social organization. Future visions have powerful consequences. So as also I'm going to relate to what Victor has written about recently, one reason that we are thinking more about the future and more intensely about this is the Anthropocene and the new temporal scales this epoch we're finding ourselves in is presenting to us, and the new questions that it raises. And the longer term we have to think, and the longer term our collective actions are shaping trajectories of systems on Earth, the more we have to take those long-term effects into our present considerations, and that has turned out to be challenging. So how we think about the future really affects what we do in the present, whether that's goal setting in our institutions, instrument choice, or policy design. So all of those political actions and governance activities are oriented towards the future in an important sense, which is why I think we can start thinking and should be starting thinking about Earth system governance as future making. So this has not really been a core framing of our field, but I think it is useful to add that to how we conceive of our own activities, because we're looking into efforts to create trajectories of future coupled human environmental systems that diverge from the business as usual or the current trends. We're kind of devising a set of social technologies of future making that we call Earth system governance or environmental governance or politics, including what Jeroen actually and Martin Heyer have recently termed techniques of futuring, right? So present activities that try to bring ideas of the future into the present and act upon them to try and shape future trajectories of the world. So I'm going to go back to this as a set of technologies for future making. And of course, that stuff is hard. So again, I'm quoting here from a recent paper that says, despite the recognition of strong temporal interdependencies, we still lack understanding of how societal and political organizations can manage these interconnections over long time horizons. So we're starting to think about this, and this paper has tried to identify some principles for that. But overall, we're lacking principles, norms, institutions that can make these really long-term linkages and can be confident that we're doing this well. There is some emerging, I would say emerging agreement among scholars though, that this activity of futuring, future making, anticipating, thinking about the future is highly political. So the future is an open space, but not a politically neutral one, with many actors projecting their interests onto it. Foresight is likely to constitute a site of politics and governance in and of itself. So that is, I think, maybe not a very new insight. This has been around since at least for a decade. Is another quote. It says the power, politics, and social relations associated with scenario products and processes have generated little attention in the social sciences. So scenario development has, of course, been a key tool of foresight and future conversations. I think all of the authors involved here would agree that this is a kind of a narrow way of thinking about future analysis and future governance, but this is often where it starts because that is the tool we've been using the most. But all of these insights combined raise a whole lot of interesting questions. I listed a few here, and Jeroen has already raised a number. But some of these are: who's involved in future thinking, and what is the role of time in their imagined futures? What are dominant timescales, and are they the right timescales, the appropriate timescales? Why are some actors better at future thinking than others? So there's also a dimension of capacity and ability and how that is distributed. Which temporal preferences for or future imaginaries are supported by the dominant actors in our current systems? Or how do power configurations shape what is and can be imagined, and what kinds of future thinking and what kinds of time horizons are relevant or not? And then how is the future, or how's time embedded in our instruments, or also how is it not? So what kinds of temporal features are maybe missing in the way we're governing Earth systems? So I've so far used kind of future thinking as the key terminology here, And there is lots of a different terminology used in this field, from expectations to anticipation. I think anticipatory governance has been kind of the dominant conceptualization of this area. But I like to use the term imagination. So I like to think about future thinking as imagination. And in a recent paper with Michelle Lee Moore, I have defined kind of imagination for the purpose of sustainability transformations as interdependent cognitive and social processes that create representations of present and possible future states of the world that can inform public deliberation, policy, decision-making, and behavior from the individual to the global scale. So that's a lot in, in a single sentence. But what's important here is that there are independent cognitive and social processes. And that term social also hides a whole lot. Actually, both of these terms hide a whole lot of material and technological dimensions of imagination as well. But that we have to look at these interdependently. I'm today most concerned with cognition, so I will focus on the cognitive dimensions, but I'd also be happy to explore some of these other social and technological questions in the Q&A. And in this paper with Michelle Lee, we kind of discussed that we're starting from a place where the literature has actually talked about 3 different kinds of imagination failures. And the first is probably best explored, the challenges that come with even imagining what climate change is like. So what's the nature of this problem? It's multiple facets that nobody, no single person can experience all of them or even multiple of them, and that are stretched out over so many time horizons from the past to the future. So that environmental imagination is really hard. But also more recently, there's been more writing about the sociological imagination and how we're not really good at understanding the social structures that are creating and recreating on a daily basis our environmental problems, especially climate change. And then we added kind of the maybe the transformative imagination, thinking about possible futures that are co-created between us, human agents, and environmental systems. These are all connected in interdependent ways, including the solutions and pathways towards different kinds of futures. So getting good at a rich and detailed future thinking, the ability to do that in our minds, that is, I think, so far something that we're struggling with and that needs further work. So I'm going to explore a little bit, I'm going to check time here, the reasons for these cognitive failures of engaging with the future. So this third imagination in particular. So there's a lot of interesting work across multiple disciplines. Psychologists, for example, have looked into what is the meaning of the future to most people, actually. And they found that the future tends to mean kind of 10 to 15 years from now. So sometime that is not today, but in the future. And after that roughly 15 to 20 years, maybe the future goes dark for most people. And the ability to imagine the future and to worry about the future is highly correlated with our frequency of thinking about the future. Now, what I find interesting about that finding is that actually it reflects to some extent what we have been doing in Earth system governance, where our maybe maximum time horizon so far has been 15 years. If you think about the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, the NDCs, we've kind of looked at like 15 years as, all right, that's how far, as far as we can tackle these problems, and have set our time horizons accordingly. And there's, of course, the well-known psychological phenomenon of distancing, that we tend to actively disengage from things that feel threatening or negative by thinking about them as stuff that happens to other people far away or far in the future. So we do not engage with future thinking because, especially regarding climate change, because it's intimidating and terrifying in so many ways. And then there's economic discounting, so important as a process that shapes how we make choices on a daily basis, as policymakers, as societies, but also as individuals. So this is not just happening in policy processes, this is actually something that our minds do very often. So overall, what this policy or what these insights tell us that we are terrible at future thinking for many good reasons that are located in our minds. So now I've looked a little bit into what does this mean, or how does future thinking actually work for climate change negotiators, assuming that these are folks who are professionals with an obligation to think about the long term, an obligation to deal with climate change, and doing future making with their jobs. And so what I found was already a little longer ago in my dissertation project was that imagining the distant future is cognitively and emotionally really challenging even for these professionals who deal with this on a daily basis. So the key pattern that is there, and maybe that's unsurprising, is avoidance. People do not imagine the future. Thinking about the future does not really affect how we're addressing climate change today, or very little. Maybe that's a form of this kind of a self-preservation mechanism, because when you do it too much and too often, you can easily become depressed or apathetic or feel powerless. And that might be happening in politics too. The dominant cognitive pattern among these folks, in addition to avoiding thinking about the future or imagining the future in some concrete terms, is denial of the possibility of failure. So there's this thinking that, you know, by 2180, we will have solved this problem with technologies, maybe social technologies we can't even think of today. So it's kind of an optimism built into governors' thinking that is interesting. And I was wondering where the reasons for that hope are coming from. And then there is very important linear thinking. Always the idea that, all right, I accept that maybe the future will be different in some sense, and we will probably observe more of the problems we already have in the present. So there will be maybe more food insecurity, there'll be more conflict. It's kind of an extension of trends that I know from my past, right? So there's a weak ability, and maybe a lack of incentives, to imagine possible, but qualitatively very different futures. That is just hard for the mind. And here I come back to something that Jeroen mentioned earlier, that also came out very strongly from my own work. The past and the future play very different roles in our present thinking and decision making. And one of the reasons for that is our cognitive architecture. Our mind has co-located past thinking, memory, and future thinking. We use past experiences, everything we have seen, we have read about, we felt, the colors, the textures of our lives, to create ideas about the future. So the past becomes cognitive source material for making up images and ideas of the future. And things we haven't experienced, we haven't seen, we haven't read about, are not part of that. Therefore, these very, let's say, rich and detailed and colorful images of the past and ideas about the past are much more influential on our current thinking than the weak, vague, uncertain ideas we have about the future that are often only built on science, and today's science, of things that haven't ever existed before, like major climate tipping points, right? So past and future have very different influence on what we think in our present, and the past is just so much more influential. It overwhelms any ideas we might have about qualitatively different futures. So now to some more recent research I have done. So I've become interested in, like, so what do climate change negotiators or participants in that global process actually think in terms of time? What are the dominant time horizons when they think about the future in the context of climate change? And here, this is a very, very small scale survey result data table. So don't put too much confidence in this, but it's a preliminary insight that hopefully informs future work. So in asking people very openly about what is the key time horizon for you when you think about the future in the context of climate change, generated open-ended responses that I categorized this way. So kind of these are the 5 years, 15 years, 30 years, 50 years, and then even 2100 and beyond 2100. And as you can see, a number of people, 12% of people had the 5-year time horizon as the one that's most important to them, which kind of coincides with NDC cycles and global stocktake. Then there was a very small number of folks who had the 15-year, apparently, 15-year time horizon, which is important for our global governance in general. That coincides with the kind of the Talanoa dialogue in the UNFCCC. And then the dominant time horizon is about 30 years, so out to the middle of the century. And we currently have one governance instrument in the UNFCCC that is on this time horizon, which is the low emission development strategies, the mid-century strategies. But then interestingly, we also have a number of folks who think about 2100, but a good group that is thinking beyond 2100. And I thought that was encouraging, because that's important, that we don't think in a particular year the future ends, or that the models that we run are dominating our thinking. So what I have been trying to do in my recent work, and what I will try to do more, is to take these ideas of the importance of time in the future to think about how can we activate and foster intertemporal thinking, especially future thinking, given that there are these cognitive challenges of doing that? What kinds of tools do we have? And I've been exploring two tools in particular. One of them is serious gaming, and the other one is fiction, climate fiction and novels or storytelling, because both of these engage our mental capacities in really interesting ways and build on strengths that we might have rather than weaknesses of future thinking. So treating imagination as kind of an anticipatory or transformative or maybe just general Earth system governance capacity, thinking about ways in which we can help decision makers or even the public become better at future thinking, I think is really an interesting challenge. So, and some of the advantages that might come with using stories like climate fiction novels or gaming techniques are that they support a lot of the mental processes that we need to think concretely about the future. And here I list some of these. I think really important is the mental simulation of future worlds, including novel solutions, the ability to use stories and games as time machines. You can step into a future in your mind with others, possibly step into a character's mind and experience both the emotions, the ideas, the places, the changes for a longer time period that allow your mind to explore that possible future in a way that it becomes part of our past experience, right? You can add what you mentally simulate to your store of mental capacities, which we use to build future ideas. So this, in this sense, I think, storytelling and gaming are really interesting avenues for doing that. And this is why I'm going to conclude. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manjana. That was super interesting. I think specifically that intersection between the individual cognitive limitations that we all face and all experience on a daily basis and the more structural concerns that we have, it's really food for thought. Victor, do you want to jump in here?
Yes, of course. I mean, wow, two excellent introductions to an extremely difficult topic, I have to say. So I'm just going to add additional thoughts to this mix. So it will be a little bit of a smorgasbord of things that I've been thinking about in the last years related to time. And I think there are three key things that I think are interesting when we talk about time, politics, institutions. One is complexity and the behavior of complex systems. The other one is crises and crises as very special types of events. I mean, we're in the midst of such a pandemic crisis at the moment. It just creates very interesting and challenging dynamics. And then the last point that I've become increasingly interested in is how important our capacity to process information is to understand change and respond to change in a timely fashion. So those would be three topics that I would like to add to this very, very rich discussion. In terms of complexity, I mean, coming from the Resilience Center, you guys will not be surprised that I'll bring this up. But I think it's not just that things change. I think that's very important. And Manjana mentioned that too. There's something about nonlinear complex systems behavior that makes time even more important and critical. So in complex systems, for example, you have lock-in. So the choices you make now locks your system into a particular pathway for a long time. So that to me is critical. The notion that we might have thresholds or tipping points in different systems is important as well, because you want to act in time before that system tips into another state indefinitely, or at least into the long foreseeable future. So to me, the properties of complex systems make the issue of time even more urgent. And of course, I mean, this type of complex systems behavior we're familiar with it. Some people talk about coral reefs, ecosystems, shallow lakes, or the Earth system. But in my particular case, and as a political challenge, when we have complex systems with tipping points and time, like how do we filter out noise from signal? Like how do we know that this system is moving towards such a change for us to be able to act? Like, is this something that will happen now, or is this something in a very, very distant future? How urgent is it? And then, of course, timing related to that signal, because I think that is an extremely challenging insight from a lot of research, not only theoretical, but also empirical, that a system will send you a signal that it is about to go into an irreversible state. And that signal will become clear only when it is too late to act, right? So, I mean, before that, you just get a lot of noise. But when you say, okay, now it's clear this system is apparently going to shift, then it is too late to act to avoid that. And you can essentially just adapt. And then the third point, again, coming from my colleagues, both theoretical and empirical work, surprise. Like systems just change in a way irreversibly or get locked in in a surprising way. You just didn't see that coming until it's there. All of these stuff sound quite theoretical, maybe not relevant, but I think it's becoming just like really on top of political agendas. I mean, this is just a small video that I grabbed from The Guardian about the Amazon and the discussions that have been 2018, 2019, 2020 around the risks of the Amazon tipping into something different, into a savanna state, going from a rich rainforest into a savanna state. And then, of course, whenever you talk about this, and we've had a lot of multiple engagements with policy and people in the finance sector, the question is, of course, like when? When is this going to happen? So the timing question as well, like, is this something that we foresee will happen in the next 5 years or in the next 10 years? That makes a huge, huge difference from a policy and investor perspective. And of course, as for any other complex system with tipping behavior, what you might suspect that you will get a clear signal when the system is already shifting. And of course, it's not just the Amazon. I found this beautiful Alarmist headline from the Daily Mail. I mean, this is on top of people's mind. How do we respond to it? And how do we sensibly create policies that are able to filter early warning signals and act on it in a politically sensible way? I don't think we're not there yet, but I think it's a super, super important insight on the links between time, complexity, and political action and institutions. The second point, of course, being these very tricky lock-in effects once you cross certain tipping points. And I mean, this is from one book chapter. I remade another image that was essentially about sea level rise. And of course, when an Earth system scientist looks at the Earth system, and you mentioned deep time, Jeroen, they look into the deep, deep future. And they would say to you, okay, depending on the actions or things that we do in the next decades, the Earth system might lock into very different futures just because of the connections between parts of the Earth system. And of course, what we are used of studying as social scientists and political scientists would be this very, very narrow temporal frame. I mean, when we look about the dynamics of international institutions, very classical work, if you think about Oren Young, for example, the decade perspective would be what you would look at. You would look at, I mean, if you have a study that manages to capture the development of international institutions over 2-3 decades, that to you is a very long time. Public-private partnerships, the same thing. And then you have electoral cycles that are much faster. We're used of looking into that very condensed time period compared to how the Earth system operates through lock-ins, tipping points over very deep time. And that to me is a massive challenge that people seem to be taking on more seriously now. And the other point is related to crises. This was something that I found extremely interesting and is extremely relevant nowadays, considering that we are in the midst of this pandemic. And the thing with crises is that they force you to act fast. So that's not very different from these very temporal Earth system machinery moving into the deep future. And crisis events, and this is from a classical book on crises. So crises are events that pose serious threats to the basic fundamental values of society or a system that forces us to make decisions, even though uncertainty is vast. And that to me is very, very different from how we normally would look at challenges associated with governance for sustainability. Governance for sustainability for a long time had a focus on long-term challenges, balancing economic, social, ecological values. and some of it being adapted to change. But crises are very serious events, and they have very different political and economic dynamics than we normally will look into. Some of the stuff that we explored a while ago related to crises would be like, how, again, into early warning signals. Maybe they were there, maybe we saw a crisis coming, but the information was diffused in very different parts of your political system. So no one was able to pick them up and translate them into action. Policymakers face tragic choices, and we see it here now. Like, it doesn't matter which option you choose as a policymaker, there will still be losers. There are like no clear win-win solutions. Just think about, for example, lockdown policies during the pandemic, or whether you try to keep it more open, etc. There will be losers and in all domains. Tragic choices, according to the crisis management literature. And then, of course, after a crisis, or when you're in a crisis for a bit of time, you get these blame games. So instead of having learning, like what did we do wrong? How could we improve? What are the institutional reforms that we need to put in place to be able to act in a better way next time? You might get into these very infected political blame games between decision makers in policy, or organizations, or even different countries, which we are likely to see after this pandemic as well. And then in the end, with such a strong focus on crises, how do we make sure that we address root causes? So again, using the pandemic as an example, once we are back on our feet after this pandemic, how do we make sure that we're not just building better epidemic alert systems, but instead address the root causes that are creating these disease risks from the beginning, such as environmental change or uncontrolled urban development, etc. So that's a tricky aspect as well. And then the last point that I want to raise related to time and timely responses has to do with information processing and something that could be called algorithmic systems. We're essentially seeing very rapid growing amounts of information floating around on our planet. You can see that slide. I think it's from the International Energy Agency, growing exponentially. I mean, a lot of this is probably cat videos or similar, but I think this just brings to mind how important the capacities for us as a society to process and make sense of all this information to deal with changing circumstances in a timely manner. And that growth is very quickly. So how do we filter this? How do we make sense of this information in a sensible way? And this is something that we see in all sectors of society. This is just one example of how rapid the creation of information and data is nowadays. So about the same time it takes for Usain Bolt to start running once he hears the starting gun at a race, which is someone clocked it to 0.165 seconds. A financial algorithm a few years ago, so this is old information actually, manages to execute around 5,000 to 10,000 different trades in a financial market. Just the speed of these automated algorithmic trading is just massive. And just to give you another contrast of the massive amounts of information, many of you probably remember the Panama Papers. This was a massive leak of data, 2.6 terabytes of data. It took hundreds of journalists to go through that data and to find and see patterns in it in terms of aggressive tax planning, tax fraud, etc. I mean, that amount of data, 2.6 terabytes of data, is produced every 30 seconds in one of the biggest stock exchanges. So just a massive amounts of data. And that forces us to think through, how do we filter through all this data? How do we make sense out of it? And how do we respond to it? We've seen the effects of that now. It's not just about financial trade. Of course, it's all these current discussions about rapid information flows related to environmental crises, misinformation, disinformation. Here on the left side, you just see a few examples of clear misinformation that spreads in social media. We did a little study on Twitter on apparently a movement that was called Yes to Meet, that moved very, very quickly. And all of these information and sense making through social media happens through algorithms. I mean, through computer code, you need to make sense of that and filtering it. And that to me has become increasingly clear how important these systems have become for our abilities to make sense of what's happening in the world and to be able to respond and to make decisions not only for the short term, but also for the long term. And those are just a number of examples of how these algorithmic systems surround us and filter the information that we get and manage to make sense of. So to me, I mean, what I see as very interesting, just to wrap up, is the fact that environmental politics, sustainability has a very long and very diverse time scale that we might consider to explore. I mean, of course, we have on the extreme right, we have the deep time challenges. And then on the very left, we have these very ultra fast cycles of phenomena. We've been focusing a lot naturally on things that take and evolve over years or over decades. If you think about institutional analysis, or maybe you work with political history, then maybe you might possibly look into hundreds of years of time. If you're interested in crises and crisis management, you look at events that unfold during days, months, maybe years, policy studies, etc. The biggest challenges ahead, of course, for us, as I see it, just to wrap up, like institutions, policy making over deep time, like over a very long time, things that would lock us in to developments hundreds of years, maybe even thousands of years into the future. How do we make sense of that? How do we study it in a sensible way? And then on the extreme left here, that I find interesting, of course, how do we govern these algorithmic systems that are filtering the information that shape the way we see the world and some of the decisions that we're taking? To me, those two areas in blue are challenging and exciting, but very, very difficult, like from an empirical point of view and methodological point of view. So just my additions to this very interesting discussion about time.
Thank you, Victor. This was also deeply stimulating. I think the question of how do we deal with timeframes so vast or so small is very much on all our minds. And I think it provided an interesting counterpoint also to Manjana's talk, where it was really about how do we conceptualize and feel this ourselves, right? And cognitively make sense of all this. And then my personal interest would always be, how do we mediate this culturally? And I think I don't want to talk too much about this because I want to open it up for questions from the floor. So please, if you have any questions, put them in the chat. But let me start by a question that came in very early on, where Rob Booth asked, how do we take people along who do not fall in the our or the we of people who already see the future as one of impending climate catastrophe, or at least something to be really worried about? And how do you take people who have what Rob Booth calls optimism or perhaps ignorance about the climatic future, along with our position in a particular way that doesn't lead to catastrophism or alienates people? And I think, Manjana, you are the most well-positioned of all of us to answer this question.
Well, I can try. So I think the question highlights something very important, and that is that we're all starting from different perspectives of what reality is, and that is part of our imagination or thinking about the future. So where are we at? And it's important to recognize that and to open future thinking up to diversity of voices, the pluralization of thinking about the future, and the generation of plural and diverse stories about desirable futures, possible futures, undesirable futures, the whole range, and all the mixes in between is really important to enable a rich public deliberation and exploration of what is a good life in the future, what are the values we share and we as collectives would like to pursue. And so in that sense, having diverse voices in there is, I think, important. In some sense, that plurality is managed in global governance, for example, through our interstate system where every country has an aggregate voice and often today already shares very different perspectives of what is climate change as a problem, or what are these problems about, and where should we be heading in the future, and with what kinds of solutions, right? These different perspectives exist, but of course it's a highly simplified look at the kinds of perspectives that exist. I think a true challenge would exist with deniers, people who are not acknowledging the reality of the problem and trying to engage that. You could still try to engage in that in terms of saying, let's think about what kind of future you desire. But for a public deliberate or for the deliberation process for governance, it would be less valuable in a conversation because it's just not fact-based, right? It's not possible to reach a future in which climate change plays no role, where you would probably have a future vision that is much more motivated by conservative, backward-looking values of like what was the past like, what we've seen like with Donald Trump, like make America great again, let's roll back globalization and ignore some of these very challenging environmental questions. So there, I think there's probably a more challenging question of how to engage that group of people who still are not able to or willing to embrace the reality of this. But beyond that, it is very important to look at the diversity of voices and create a diversity of narratives. And also acknowledging that lots of people are not, for example, indigenous communities often think about these major global problems as this is not the first time kind of the world is ending in our stories, right? We've experienced apocalypse of similar kinds before. So how do we even narrate the redestruction of worlds or the threats that these people face compared to what maybe I have hinted at as us or our perspective. So that should always be a multiple we, of course.
Thank you, Manjana. I found myself on the verge of adding during your conversation on the good life, where you're saying, well, it's really important to embed this in a story of what people want, the kind of life people want to live. And when we're talking also about these people, the groups of people that we don't typically reach, I think one of the things that we tend to forget to do is fully engage with value systems and underlying conceptions of what they think life should be about. And we shouldn't be trying to reach other people on the facts of climate change. Should try to reach them under their value systems that underlie them. But we now have a bunch of questions in a very short time. So, Victor, I wanted to raise one particular question to you, also because you brought up the notion of limits. Gabriela Alonso Yanes asks, can we speak to the notion of limits, we as panelists, to the notion of limits in relation to the notions of time and future thinking? So what role has the idea of limits played in modern thought development, from economics to environmental governance, and what does it continue, this is my adding, but what does it continue to play in that thinking?
Well, I'm not totally sure I'm getting the question right, but if I interpret it correctly, I mean, the notion of limits in sustainability is extremely contested and debated. Ever since the 1970s and the limits to growth, it's been one of the hottest political topics at the moment. And I see that discussion unfolding at the very moment. I mean, some people would question that there is even something as planetary boundaries, for example. Some people in the planetary boundaries narrative wouldn't even say that boundaries are limits. There is safe operating space. So I think the discussion about limits is alive and kicking. It's still alive. And I think one of the most tangible areas for continued debate would be what is the role of technology and human ingenuity of overcoming these limits. That would be my reflection on it.
Maybe I can add something. It is, I think, a very important question to ask related to the role of science and knowledge. Because I think these ideas about the limits to growth or the planetary boundaries, or there might be real limitations to what we can do to environmental systems before they collapse, right? So how far can we push things? And that this notion of limit is imposed or introduced into the conversation by science. And therefore, what is the role of science and the knowledge we have about how environmental systems work? How does that play a role in how we envision the future and what we do, compared to our values and our ideas about the good life and our desires, right? To what extent does it really impose a constraint of what we imagine as the good future? Or does it guide our thinking? Or should it be not relevant for that? So how do we relate the ideas, so what we know about the functioning of Earth systems to our thinking about the future and our choices regarding those futures? So figuring that relationship out, especially if we make future thinking a more, let's say, pluralistic and stakeholder-driven exercise rather than an elite and policymaker exercise, is really important.
Thank you, both of you. That was really insightful. We're almost at the close, so I would like to close off with a question from the chat that I think is on everyone's mind right now in the particular time frame that we're living in, because Jonas Torrens asks, is the experience of this global pandemic likely to change how we approach the future? And if so, how would it change our approach to the future? Because his impression is that it has, for many, disrupted the assumption of continuity. But do we agree? Do we have other opinions? And I want to leave this as an open question. Victor or Manjana, jump in when you feel you have a response to this.
I don't know, Victor, do you have a rapid one?
I can give it a try. I mean, that's a really good question. I think very different people will draw very different lessons from this pandemic. First of all, I think the experiences for different social groups and different countries have been so different that it will be difficult to say that this will be one major shift in the way that we think about X, Y, and Z. I don't see that very clearly. I think we as a species, humans as a species, are incredibly adaptable and forget things. There is a notion in ecology called shifting baselines. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but essentially we compare what we see now with some just looking back a couple of years rather than a very long time before. So that means that I think that we will remember the pandemic and the effects of the pandemic for a little while, but then in 10, 20 years time, it's not going to be on top of our minds, not something that will have changed our lives forever. That's not how I would guess. But this is really pure speculation from the top of my mind.
Yeah, let me try and add. So there has been a lot of writing recently that is trying to say that the pandemic will change a lot of stuff, including how we respond to climate change. And I'm actually not sure we will really see a significant change. We have certainly experienced that governments can respond quickly and significantly to major problems. And I think we have learned that our global system is much less stable and our lives can change much more rapidly than we were able to imagine before. But I don't necessarily think that this will impact overall how we approach governance, that it will affect the political dynamics that have been holding back environmental governance or climate change governance over the last couple of decades. And in many ways, it also is not going to change the trajectory of greenhouse gases. Right? We're already seeing that in the trends and the observations right now, and economic plans for how we're going to get our economies back on track are definitely not sustainable in the sense that many might have hoped. So I think in some ways, maybe the experience has added to our imagination and our ability to see futures, how disruptive singular events like this can be, and the idea that this can happen more frequently. And so even having that new idea in our minds and that experience behind us now of a year plus of living in this condition might have created a new set of ideas about how the future might unfold. But as Victor said, I'm also not sure how and whether that will really affect our thinking about climate change and our governance of climate change. So we'll have to see.
Yeah, I have to agree for the most part with Victor and Manjana, but I would say that there are smaller shifts that we see also in our relationship with the future. And I think one of them is the increasing debate, which we've seen in climate change for about 30, 40 years, on the role of science and scientific projections in policymaking. That is very, very visible now. So this is about the immediate future, but we can have that same sort of discussion into the future. Now it's brought into to the public eye much more. I'm not sure which way that will tip, but I think that makes a big difference. And there might be some shift, and I hope this may be more speculative hope than anything else, some shift in what we deem to be most important in terms of our futures and our lives. But who knows? Yeah, let's leave it with a thank you, a very big thank you to Manjana and Victor. This was really wonderful to have you here, and I hope that I can discuss with you publicly or privately in the future. And yeah, Gustav, do you want to take it from here?
Yes, thank you, Jerome. Thank you, Victor. Thank you, Manjana, for taking your time to present your thoughts on this very important topic. Really nice food for thought, and very interesting to see how this pandemic will kind of shift our perceptions, or if they will indeed shift our perceptions about the future. I just want to end this ESG speaker session once again by thanking all the panelists, all the attendees, and all the questions. Unfortunately, we did not have time to address all the questions, but I want to add a open invitation to all, both panelists and to attendees, to join us in a Zoom chat, just a meeting where everyone is visible, everyone can talk, in about 5 minutes. So we'll take a small break. My colleagues will post a Zoom link in the chat if you're interested and you just want to have a bit of a conversation going afterwards. But this is it for us now officially. So thank you once again for tuning in. We'll be back in April with another ESG speaker series, and we will announce this shortly. But that's it for us. So thank you very much. And please follow the Zoom link. We will keep it this window open for a little bit, so you can find the link. But thank you very much once again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for hosting. Bye, everyone. Thanks for being here.
Bye.